directly with Raytheon on scoping out the opportunities to use Wall Street funding basically to plug the gap in the program. For the last year and a half, we have on our own continued to try to move this program through the FAA, this concept through the FAA, and to the White House and members on the Hill. And we'll talk more about that as we get into this. So I have on the phone, go to the next chart please, so Hank Krakowski. Hank is the former Chief Operating Officer of the ATO. Maybe you guys have met him. I know a number of you know him. Frank, Hank, you want to say anything?
Yeah, good morning everyone. Looking forward to the discussion today. I think we have a short window of opportunity here to really move it on, so looking forward to your thoughts.
Thank you. We also have, next slide please, Phil. Charlie Keegan, who's been working very closely with us on this initiative for the last at least 2 years. Charlie, you want to make any opening remarks?
Money is all about PIGO. So if there's money behind a program, you get PIGO. And Mike's initiative allows the program to go. So without any other source, this gap has been on the table with the government for several years. We've made sure that that's been clear. And I think only in the last 60 days is there acknowledgement that there's a gap. So slow but true, we'll keep the ship steady. And then I do think that for the opportunity for everyone that provides these kinds of services and products, that this kind of approach is what's necessary, because they obviously can't see that there isn't a funding stream. So something's got to give. That kind of reform is almost an imperative to put a program like this size together.
Thank you. And lastly, we have Michael Ball, who's been a fantastic resource for us. Michael?
Thank you. I won't talk long. I think this program is critically important to DoD, Homeland Security, and the FAA. Our radar infrastructure is a disaster right now, and there's no real significant funding for the kinds of radar that particularly the FAA needs going forward. And this program offers a great opportunity, but as long as the JPO focuses on other things and doesn't focus on solving the funding gap, then industry is just going to end up doing what Michael, I think, has mentioned. At some point, we just have to just cut our bait and say it's not worth it. And that's sort of the decision that led to my retirement from Northrop a couple of years ago. Maybe they were wise. Thank you.
Good point. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we're the current status of SENSR. I mean, we're all experts in sensors since we're all in the room here. Go to the next chart, please. Okay, so I wanted to start by pointing out that there is nothing of any significance programmed or coming from the White House or the annual appropriations process for SENSR that would come anywhere close to solving the funding gap. That's basically our point. If you took a close read of the President's budget for 2020, I pulled out a few things here, but in effect what the President's budget recognizes is that the conventional modern, the F&E budget in particular for the FAA is really just focused on their normal course of business. There's breakout and mention in this 500-page document about only 2 FAA programs. One is Datacom, and the other is funding to begin to integrate the drone sector into the National Airspace System. There's no mention of radars, no mention of sensor. It's completely silent on all of those things. And yet when we talk to the White House, they look at the sensor program as being a critical piece of infrastructure that is could be as significant to our defense and industrial baseline as GPS was. It's a big program, new technologies. As Michael had mentioned, it's been a disaster. The fact that we have radars, especially coastal surveillance radars, that are decades and decades old. And the new technology that they expect to use has actually been around for 20 years, phased array technology, right? So there's not White House or congressional support to give the FAA funding to plug the gap. And we, in our discussions with these players on the Hill, et cetera, there's a concern that the FAA has been given billions of dollars for next gen and hasn't been able to deliver. Why would we give the FAA billions of dollars to play around with sensor when they don't even have a performance specification provided and they don't have any cost baseline? So there is a gap, and there's a reason for that gap. It's that there has to be another way. The auction is coming up in less than 5 years. And in order to maximize the proceeds from that auction, significant work has to be done to replace the ASRs and the CASRs, the 123 of them that are currently occupying the spectrum to be auctioned, basically. Next chart. So we worked on, and we want to highlight what we think are 4 reasonable options for the FAA. And of course, we don't know what the FAA is doing. Many of us are into the program office to talk, and we get snippets of this, that, and the other thing. But I'll tell you one thing, that one of the most important options, which we're going to talk about today, the FAA has been unable to mount any kind of analytics against, and therefore they've gone nowhere with our proposals, even though we've made ample effort to underscore the option of and the possibilities of using private capital to fund the gap. They've not staffed up to assess our profiles. We've told them for 2 years to go and hire expert financial advisors. They need only actually walk down the street and go to the DOT and go into the Office of the Secretary of Transportation to find a dozen people who work on private capital programs that fund highways and rail and things of that nature. But the FAA is unable to step up to that sort of challenge, which is ridiculous. One of the options the option they're praying for is congressional appropriations. Obviously, the pros of that option is that it's what the FAA does. They wait for money. The cost of these programs that are analyzed by cost analysts inside the FAA basically they use the cost of capital, but it's the price of the 10-year T-bill, which is today at about 1.75%. And that's important because we're going to talk a little bit about the cost of private capital. It's higher, but it's not much higher. The FAA PMO has complete authority to manage the sensor program under this sort of structure. And so the negatives behind this or the cons rather, is that sensor would be the largest single appropriation ever in FAA history if it was to be funded by appropriations. And we talked a minute ago about the problems with next gen and the lack of discipline inside the FAA that Congress will not get comfortable with under any circumstances. I should also point out that it's been 4 years almost since the Spectrum Reallocation Act was passed, and the PMO is nowhere. I mean, it's really concerning that they couldn't at least put together a performance spec. That'd be nice. And yet that has not been possible unless anybody has any news. From what we understand, they're still trying to muster the capabilities to do that. So the other issue with appropriations is that they're subject to the usual stuff, shutdowns and delays in passing appropriations. Continuing resolutions are not the best idea when it comes to funding multi-year capital programs. By the way, the $12 billion estimate that we put together, which I will talk about in a few minutes, it could be less because the program, we understand, has been de-scoped now. But it's still going to be a program in the range of probably about $10 billion based on our analysis. Next chart. So that was one. Option 2 is maybe the DoD would take the program over. If they've de-scoped the program and they're removing a number of the hundreds of FAA radars, then this looks more like a DoD program. And there are some pros with this. Certainly the DoD's experience with large, complex, multi-year programs is extremely good. And this is a program that has all those elements to it. Very complicated. There's a big civil engineering construction component to this effort. And so also the DoD has great experience with dual-use technologies, which is what this radar technology can offer in the drone space, in the urban air mobility space. And there are lots of ways to extend this technology into civil use for new aerospace and aviation markets and systems that are coming along. So the cons of this approach, of course, there's the transferring PMO control would really disrupt the program. But we understand there is conversation going on about this. So there's also the issue that the FAA AMS probably has more flexibility than the FARs, although people will debate that.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So I hear this comment about AMS having more flexibility than the FARs, but I don't understand why that flexibility is deemed to be important and what that flexibility addresses.
Yeah.
Do you have a view?
Sure, we do. We do. That flexibility, we've actually done a fair amount of work in this area because we have other programs that come up against the limitations of both the FARs and AMS funding programs. But the FAA, including Pat McNall, who is the legal authority for AMS inside of the FAA, view all of the unusual elements of our funding proposal to be within the scope of the AMS. And there are elements of this that are in my white paper. So if you've got a copy of the white paper, or I can resubmit it to you, there's a breakdown and discussion about why AMS works well for this program. Next,
Mike?
Yes.
I mean, a couple of things. One,
Yeah.
the experience that FAA has on OTAs is huge, right? I mean, DoD is now talking about OTAs, but OTAs have been a function of AMS since '96. They're almost 3 decades behind that power curve, right? They're 2 decades behind that power curve, where that experience weighs out about how much collaboration and participation that the FAA has had with industry on certain programs. Not that it's been effective here, I'm not saying that, but the other part is when you go to best value and you have a broad range of potential solutions, that FARS is kind of limited in in sort of the over-under about how far you can be in best value from low price. And it's pretty hardcore because there's case law that identifies you can't be of value if you're too high or too low. And in this broad range of potential solutions, you can be billions different on the high side or the low side for good reason, then it would be unacceptable under FARS where it's acceptable under AMS. Not that you can't waive FARs and you can waive anything, but I mean, just on the surface, that is a function of being able to do that under AMS without doing those kinds of things.
Right. So, a good counterpoint to our argument here for the FAA is that the FAA does maintain the coastal surveillance radars. So, there's an experience base inside the FAA that would provide them, even though they're not going to be the owners of the asset, highly qualified to look at life cycle costs and things of that nature. Next chart. So the third option is for the sensor program to do nothing until the auction occurs, and there's a commercial opportunity in 2025 for anybody who wants to wait that long. I think just looking around this room, at least a few of us will be retired by that time. So, but that may also be a blessing. The big con with all of that is that if the L-band radars are still occupying the spectrum, what is the auction value worth? And we've heard from experts various opinions on this that I could just lump into one bucket called not very much. So, and it's because it would take 5 years or more to replace those radars and free up the L-band where the clock is ticking here. So every month that goes by and there's no action means it's actually a risk to our bondholders. So we're beginning to question whether there's sufficient time. Our repayment is dependent on auction proceeds. That's a very important risk offset for us. So we're very watching very carefully. The last option is the option that we've put on the table, which has to do with providing funding. And of course, the next few charts are going to deal with that. But basically, some of the pros of this is that we can make capital available pretty quickly. And if there's going to be a competition, there won't be a need for capital for 2 years, probably. If there is a different approach where the industry gets together and says, hey, we're going to work together and we're going to bring our own funding for this, then there's the opportunity to bring the schedule forward. We're quite sure under a scenario like what I'm describing here that Congress would get behind this type of initiative where the private sector is more or less in charge of the spending. Believe it or not, that sounds dangerous. But as bondholders, we want to know that there are certain aspects of these contracts that are going to be fixed price in order for us to willingly fund this program.
Is there any congressional support right now? Are there any congressmen or senators who've been briefed on this?
Yes. Yeah. So we're not starting at zero. But what we do need, and the reason why we have this meeting, is that we need industry to go with us back up on the Hill. That's what we need. So it's, for us to show up and opine about the beauties of private capital is one thing, but if we have an industrial base that says we don't see any other alternative, and we'd like Congress and the White House to get behind an industry-led effort to do this program, and that there's still time prior to the auction to make significant progress on this on the sensor program. So Congress can also delay the auction by a year. That would probably be helpful at this stage. So they have the ability to do those things. And I will say that what we have been talking about here with this program really fits the policy direction of the White House. The White House has explained and has confirmed in our discussions that they view infrastructure as something that the private sector should get involved in. This is infrastructure. This is just because it's radars doesn't mean it's not as important as other infrastructure like highways. I mean, this is fundamentally stuff that's at the backbone of our national defense. And so, just to rattle off a few points that the White House likes to see, they want to see the private sector leading these efforts. They want to see private capital involved. They want to see reduction in taxpayer cost and risk, which a program like this, structured the right way, could deliver. We've estimated about $3 billion in taxpayer savings versus a standard FAA procurement, and we can prove it. So we have the analytics to argue in favor of that.
Just say, was that $3 billion? Did you say the
$3 billion savings. Yeah.
Over
That includes
over what time period?
that's over the roughly 7 years. So that figure also included FAA radars. So, since the target's moving, we can redo our analysis. We haven't done that, but we can, and we'd like to do that analysis with you guys in the room, so that you can see, how the numbers come together, and why this is a very powerful argument, both on the Hill and at the White House. It's a very powerful argument. If you can say that the taxpayer will have less risk and almost guaranteed savings, that's enough to push this into PGO. Next chart. All right, so we're going to go very quickly through what our proposal had entailed, and I know there are at least one of you in this room that have heard this before, so apologies for going over this again. But so just very quickly, reflecting on what the sensor program is, I think there's some question about NOAA, and there's also these days some question about the FAA radars. and we're waiting for details so we can remodel. Yes?
When you say FAA radars, you mean the terminal radars?
Yeah.
Or, okay.
Yeah. The next chart shows. So the L-band radars are the Carsers and the Arcer 4s. There are 123 of these, according to analysis that we rely on. The S-band radars are listed here. There are over 600 of these radars. But those have been included in the sensor scope until very recently, when we understand that a spectrum allocation committee, I forget the name, maybe you guys would remember what the title is, but there's a new committee that was formed earlier this year and to advise on the sensor program, and I believe it was suggested that anything that's not in the L-band may not qualify. That's what's up.
Do you know who's on that committee?
Well, I can't even remember the name of the committee.
OMB,
standing in front of you,
NTIA, FCC?
It is that type of group, yeah. Yeah, there's a DOD person on the committee. I don't know if there's an FAA person. I actually didn't really look into it. But why don't we just make a note, James or Phil, and we'll go and see if we can find out who exactly is on that committee. Yeah, they're certainly worth talking with. We haven't briefed them on this, but I'm sure they'd be, quite interesting. And as we look at a communications plan.
Michael?
Yes.
Michael? Yeah, that committee is actually OMB and FCC centric. I'm not sure that DOD or whatever actually it's the technical committee that reviews the proposal for use of spectrum allocation funds.
Technical.
And they're the ones that seem to be pushing back, at least from the informal comments I've gotten from some of the big deal members when we met with them back in August. That they're saying basically that the legislation only provides for replacing the systems that are decommissioned to free up the spectrum.
Having said that, this is still a very significant program. I mean, it's an $8 to $10 billion.
Absolutely, and again, that position could be changed if Congress dictates, or if some other external pressures give FAA, DoD, etc., the chance to totally replace the radar infrastructure in an efficient manner using the spectrum funds, despite this committee's opinion.
Next chart. We pulled this through FOIA. This is the data is a bit old, a couple of years old, but this is the cost accounting system report that looks at FAA's current costs to just maintain the existing radars. So if the time reporting system is working well, the cost for supporting just the 780 roughly radars is about $266 million per year. That's labor, it's materials. You'll get a copy of this table if you haven't already seen it. We've made this available. We've even given it to the FAA. They hadn't seen it before, quite remarkably. And I think there's also some opinion that the FAA thinks other costs should go in here. But why is this important? It's because that $266 million is certainly going to drop when you put new equipment in. That is not electromechanical, it's mostly electrical and electronics. So that's a budget that we've analyzed to look at the before and after of FAA costs, basically.
So is that what the FAA carries on its books for what it spends? Does that also include the money that DoD gives?
It does. There's a line here for DoD reimbursement. So DoD reimburses the FAA for the Carcer and Arcers. I think it's about $50 million. It's in here somewhere. Yeah. But this is cost accounting system information. So back 20 years ago.
Not necessarily real money.
Well, when I was a partner at Arthur Andersen, we installed the cost accounting system at the FAA. That was one of my projects. And this is the accounting system of record. This is the system that Congress uses to keep the FAA, honest. So this is official cost numbers. I can stand here in front of you and say that the FAA has to pay attention to this because these are the numbers Congress uses.
So would the system that Arthur Anderson installed pass Arthur Anderson's own audit for commercial entities?
Yes. In fact, the system that we implemented was the one that we put into McDonnell Douglas in the years beforehand. So now, of course, there's Arthur Anderson. You could question Enron, but if you can get over that, the system it continues to be refined, but the Inspector General of the Department of Transportation has been supervising the refinements to the system almost since the very first day. Yeah. So you can count on it. We pulled this data, the Office of the CFO of the FAA produced this information on our request, basically.
And so one last question, sorry to bug you. Former finance accounting guy in recovery. How does that 266 number match with what they traditionally asked for in that range? Because obviously that's the litmus test. If they think they've got it all in there, that's what they're asking for. If they don't, they're asking for a different number.
Yeah, so I've always thought it's a black art between what the cost accounting system produces and what's in their annual appropriations. I think that I've never understood it after many years of trying to figure that out.
Amen.
Yeah, but this is actually what they spent. This is from timesheets. It's from invoices for parts. It's these are not estimates. These have to be bottom-up based and far more accurate than what you can see in an appropriations line item. And you see there is some F&E in here. There's F&E. This is ops. From the F&E side, about 95 million of that. But hardly any of that. This is SLEPs, perhaps, or remediation of broken radars. It's not censored. This is one of the points is that the FAA's appropriations of $3 billion per year. Sorry, Congress's appropriation of $3 billion per year for F&E is completely inadequate. In fact, in NEXA's estimate, the Federal Aviation Administration has a $50 billion capital shortfall. If you look across NextGen and communications programs like FTI and so forth, buildings, TRACONs that are falling apart. There's about a $50 billion capital need. And if the FAA is going to get $3 billion a year, what does that do? It just compounds the problem that the FAA has, basically.
But it's the reason the systems out there now are older than some people in this room.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Older than millennials, of which we have a couple. Next chart. This is their revised acquisition plan. All I can say about this is that there's nothing about funding the gap. But the gap runs easily from, let's see, there's the auction here. And where are we today? We're back here. They've announced yet another delay. Things continue to move to the right. And that window is just getting narrower. When we started looking at this a couple of years ago, we felt that some quick action would mean there'd be 6 years or so for capital to flow in and the industry to be able to begin construction and finish the radar designs. We can even fund research and development as part of this program. I mean, the bonds, the color of the money in the bonds, it's sort of ubiquitous. Whatever the program needs to succeed, we would put up that capital because our goal is to try to get as many radars replaced that are in the L-band spectrum to maximize the proceeds of the auction, basically. And our funding is multi-year funding. We don't have to go back to Congress every year. We put up 5 or 6 years worth of working capital. So that gives the industry the assurance it needs to be able to go forward. Oh, I added this yesterday, just, determined that they had to, produce a development plan that included both military and civil applications. The DoD wanted GPS very badly, and they found a lieutenant colonel who eventually became a general who stepped in, and his name is escaping me for the moment, but it'll come back. I'll figure it out. They put a guy who was technically a PhD and a very competent promoter of the program. But we don't hear this program being promoted the way it ought to be. This is a big program, biggest program the FAA's ever had. And it's a pretty big program from a DoD scale standpoint. But it's not being, pushed as a national asset that needs to have, the attention of senior people in Congress, the White House, and so forth. But we can change that. I think we can change that, and we can do it pretty quickly. Next chart.
Mike,
Yes.
so with the plan you're proposing, I know the FAA still talks about potentially going through a down select process and doing a piece of the development by, what would they down select to?
Yeah.
So would a funding gap solution cover that activity too?
Yes, it could. Although I would think that if the capital is formally available, that the industry should decide how to do it. And if that means a technical runoff, I suppose that would be okay. I mean, we'd be prepared to fund that if the final goal was to get most of the radars replaced. I mean, that's key to us. If we need, we probably would need to extend the auction by a year, given how tight things are now. And we're bumping up against both sides of the schedule here. But I think that's a discussion that ought to rage first within industry.
But how do you see the date of the auction? Because the FAA says it's like set in stone, you can't move it. And you talk about.
I disagree. I mean, Congress can push it back. I think if we had a sensible program that industry brought to Congress and the White House, who the FAA reports to, they'd see the merits, and the idea of a fly-off that's not funded is not very enticing for anybody, is it? Anybody here want to do a fly-off with no money? So putting the capital into this and then deciding, between the industry and the banks, the best way to do this, and maybe we have 2 radars or 3 radars, but I think the industry is the most competent to determine what the industrial pathway forward is. And if there's work for everybody in this, there's either work for everybody, or work for only a few, or no work at all. And only one of those 3 options, I think, is fundable. So these are some of the benefits of what we call innovative financing programs. I mean, there's the budget realities that Congress is not going to write a check to have the FAA spend that money doing whatever it wants to do. Innovative financing is an approved policy option. Basically, the White House has said this is the way we want to organize our fiscal book for infrastructure. Finally, we can design an innovative financing program that perfectly fits Sensor. So we can design the financing to incorporate a fly-off if anybody wants to do that. I think what we could do substantially here is that there's a very significant civil engineering piece to this program. I mean, there are 123 sites. There's a site selection analysis that has to be done. We can fund that. But construction and pouring concrete are low-risk, long lead time items. So 123 sites, even if we make one assumption right now that all those sites are going to be used for the next 123 radars, you're going to need to complete the civil construction of those sites and get them ready for the technology that's going to be installed there. You can start that right away. There's no need to design the radars first and then pour concrete second. It needs to be the other way around. That's a thoughtful way of a national construction program, 123 sites, or maybe when we're done, it's 100 sites. But the civil part of this is probably 2 or 3 years. Multiple, construction teams deployed in many, many locations across the United States. Every state is going to have a benefit from this program. Next slide. So if you haven't seen this chart before, this is our simple way of explaining how an innovative financing program works. So it begins by recognizing that industry is going to do the work. Industry is 100% responsible for and is going to get fully paid for deploying the new radars. We split it up into a construction consortium and an operating consortium, just so from the standpoint of our financial analysis we could look at various options, including having the FAA radars operated as a service. So that's what this was all about. Okay? And the FAA is always interested in that, if they can get over the issue of funding. There's a special purpose vehicle that's always used in these programs. This is like a public-private partnership. But the SPV is a legal entity staffed by a team of probably about 20 people whose responsibility is to administer the funding. And the SPV is going to manage the contracts with the consortia that do the work. They're going to manage it in the sense that they're controlling the funding, and so this group has to work to get paid. I mean, we're happy to pay advances to contractors. There's no issue with any of that. What, as bondholders, and I'm speaking now as a bondholder, we're over here, okay? So what we want to know is that the money that we deploy is contractually obligated properly, and that the contractors are performing the work according to their commitments with cost, schedule, and time. The bondholders, which are financial institutions, insurance companies, pension funds, etc., they would be purchasing probably 7 or 10-year bonds, something in that range. The interest rates are probably going to be about 1 percentage point above the 10-year T-bill rate. And this is a premium that the private sector needs. So if we were to do the bonds today, that'd be 2.75%. And when you think about the cost, it's a pretty attractive, equation, given you may not have this program any other way, basically. So our role is to keep the capital costs down. We have proof from other projects that we've done, et cetera, that that's sort of what the range is. The bonds would be either not serviced or partially serviced over the period of performance until the spectrum reallocation, until the auction proceeds are available. They can be partially serviced if the DoD and the FAA make partial payments, which is totally appropriate, but it has to be negotiated. Or, as bondholders, we can sit there and let our interest accrue without any payment. We can do either. There are complexities with both, but yes.
So the way you set it up, assuming the agencies involved, DHS, DoD, FAA would be willing to play along, basically they would be responsible for the coupon payments of any for the 1.75%, 2.75% for any of the money that basically was sent out at the time it sends out. So
yeah, well, firstly, you don't.
It sounds like a revolving credit.
Yeah, the only thing I just want to point out is that we will sell the bonds as we need them. So we're not going to have a big shelf where we're sitting on 10 billion of capital and letting that accrue. We have the ability to sell and resell bonds. We package them up so that we have capital a few months before we actually intend to deploy it. And we can change all that, the way the bond markets work. And there's also bond insurance that we get. So this program has to eventually be scored by Moody's or S&P or Fitch, but that's the way municipal bonds and other bonds are process, yes.
But if you do sell along the way, you do have interest rate risk, right, because of the cost of funds. in the bond market.
There is interest rate risk, yes, because the 10-year T-bill floats.
Okay.
Um,
But you said something about insurance. In the write-up, I read something about insurance.
Yeah,
Might
so-
cap that, or-
If you look at municipal bonds, I have a chart on that actually, so why don't you?
Sorry.
Why don't you wait? Yeah, good. I'm glad you're asking these questions. This is not an, well, the auction process and tying it to this program is very unusual. There's nothing, as far as we know, like this. But it's not that hard to figure out. And by the way, a small note is that we can actually get insurance to guarantee a certain minimum spectrum value. These days, the insurance markets are pretty creative. And if we wanted to insure 12 billion in bonds and the auction proceeds only reached 11, we could purchase insurance to cover that.
So that's more on the capital raise, not on the interest rate, in terms of insurance.
That is correct, although it does add to the cost of the program. Because to buy bond insurance can be 2% to 7 or 8% of the bond value itself. Depends. But that's a one-time cost, and there are bond insurance brokers. It's actually a pretty frothy industry these days. I'll tell you one thing that's really helped the bond insurance industry to mature is the space business, where 10 years ago it was really hard to get any insurance on vehicle launches, but nowadays it's very common. So the insurance industry is really willing to work jointly on things like this. Next chart. I'm almost done, so I'm anxious to get on with the conversation. Our partners for this on Wall Street include the Carlyle Group, who have a history of investing in the aerospace sector. They are quite active and interested in providing through their syndicate, which in all likelihood includes the other banks, to make this funding go forward. This is not a lot of money for Carlyle. And in fact, what typically happens with these banks is that they'll put up an equity piece. They'll have a higher rate of interest or dividend, if you like, that is also built into the cash flows and returns that we work on. So this is our world. This is where we have other projects with Carlyle right now. Next chart.
Mike, I was just curious.
Oh, go back, please.
Yeah, what role, if any, have these guys all played in trying to move this forward as well?
So they've been behind the scenes with us. We've had meetings on Wall Street and here. What their view is that the industry, they need to hear from industry. That's all. And so that's another part of this equation. So, hearing from us, going with us to the White House, et cetera, that's all fine and good. But, we want to fund an industrial consortium. And that's the player that's not yet at our table. Well, we have a nice table here,
But you're funding the government, and the government controls
no.
the distribution.
The government will not control the distribution. We will not do that.
So you're going to fund the consortium.
We will fund the consortium, yeah.
Once-
The FAA, go back to, oh, thank you. So the FAA will, through concession agreements and other forms of agreement, have absolute visibility into what is being done here. So the FAA's, if you want to think about it, there's a board of directors here, and the FAA is part of that board of directors. But we do not want our funding to be controlled by the FAA. We have no control over the FAA. And through contracts, what happens, the way you negotiate these things, it's like highway programs. In the end, all of the players here, and the bondholders, and the government sit in a room like this with lawyers, and we basically put agreements together that are airtight and that allow us to proceed. And that's one of the reasons why it's important for the consortium to understand that this can't be a cost-plus contract. There can be cost-plus elements that we can deal with, but a large portion of this, like the construction, the civil construction stuff, that needs to be,
Fixed.
It should be fixed, yeah. You can build in a great margin, cover your risk, but we need some certainty with respect to expenditures. Yeah.
So this impacts the SER and that it forms this consortium, this legal entity that's awarded a contract that then engages with you.
Yes. Yeah. Well, we're just the lenders. I mean,
You're the enablers then. right?
our capital should allow the program to proceed with gusto, by the way. We could easily put, more cash up front to complete the development of the radars, to complete the planning. We've even put funding into our scenarios in case there isn't sufficient manufacturing capacity to build out all the radars. I think that's a lesser issue if you take the FAA radars out. But we're able to deploy capital to build a factory. That's part of this, if needed. Whatever's needed to ensure that the construction gets underway and completed. That's basically what we do. So when you think about how Airbus works, or Boeing for that matter, when they build these factories in the United States, Airbus, the cost of the capital for that factory has to be amortized across 1,000 aircraft that are going to come out of that factory. So this is a little different, but we can easily absorb those costs.
So unlike highways, there's a ton of installation, integration, optimization, extensive testing, probably some key sites, and all the things that the government will need to do to certify, commission.
Yeah,
pick
so
your favorite
that's a
term.
good example. So in this, part of this agreement is that the FAA or the DoD or both are responsible for certifying compliance. It's not your job or our job, it's the government's job to take that on. And they likely would pay the costs associated with that. That would make sense. I mean, we could fund it, but it's
Right, so I would imagine that the money that the government spends to support the program is their money.
yeah, that's right. Not ours. We don't need to mix it. The agreements can parse responsibility for these various programs. So if you want to think about it, the way to engage in a program like this is to have everybody in a room laying out the details of these programs, and what would the private sector fund, what makes sense, and what should the DoD and the FAA fund, and how do those work alongside each other. But we don't want to manage government dollars, and we don't want the government to manage our dollars, and there's no need for that. We're willing to take on the risk of pouring concrete and financing the purchase of the radars.
Well, and the risk of spectrum being,
And we'll take the risk of that. We'll take that risk. Yeah.
Would you have a seat at the source selection table?
I think under what I'm describing, the source selection process is addressed at the very beginning. In other words, what we're suggesting is that the private sector, that you guys, come up with a solution that involves as many of you as you can collect, probably led by one of the big integrators. Maybe it's a Bechtel, or maybe it's a Raytheon, and that way you don't have to work for 2 years on a competition. You can work for the next 6 months on an implementation.
So I was missing that aspect of this.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is that industry partners come together and make an offer to the government,
Complete with funding.
complete with funding, and there's no competition or source selection process involved.
Right. So there is the importance of forming of as broad-based a consortium as you can get. there are a lot of small companies that like a piece of this. And that'll be part anyway of any competition where you have a small business set aside and what have you. And you can preempt that if you come up with an approach that it's not so much winner take all, it's that this is how industry needs to work together in order to be able to do this and to not waste money. And there's no money for FAA is not going to pay for a fly-off. We haven't seen, in our view, any evidence of that. If you're counting on a fly-off, I think that we can go beyond that pretty quickly.
That seems like the biggest risk to this whole concept, right, is that the view that it's a self-dealing kind of a structure. I mean, I'm not saying it is, but I'm just saying the fact that, it's very intriguing, but it's also, that to me seems like the biggest risk, right? Like the FAA or the government or Congress is going to say, what right does this industry consortium have to come and essentially seize or have access to the auction proceeds, right? Even though they're solving a problem, how do you know it was the best solution at the right price? You know what I mean? I don't know, that's the part that I'm struggling with.
Yeah.
How do you sell Congress? That's what I think is the holdup of this idea. I like it, but.
Well, I think there are ways to minimize the view and the actual thought that would happen. Like, for example, as lenders, we're not going to fund a party for 5 years. We're willing to fund what it costs at reasonable margins to get this work done. So it's not an open-ended tap for capital. And the contracts themselves have to be very clear in that certain aspects of this need to be fixed price, and that would be one of our conditions for putting the capital on.
So can I explore your question a little bit? Just so that I understand what's going on. So bridge, this is how you do a bridge. So government comes in, does a bridge, and they get the deal that they want, the bridge that they want, the look that they want. How would you think this is different than that though? And that's what I'd like to understand a little better.
So it seems like when they're building a bridge, the government's saying we want the bridge to look and feel and act like these
Yeah, it's
specs,
more spec'd out.
right?
Yeah,
So it's spec'd out,
yeah.
and then it goes out to bid, and supposedly or hopefully it's a fair process, and the best price performance wins, or whatever the criteria.
Whatever the criteria is.
Right, and then the funding shows, the funding's already allocated or approved, and the project starts. This is interesting because, in a way, the government's sitting on a spectrum that it says is worth a lot of money, and it probably is. I don't have any doubts about that. And yet it's incapable of essentially leveraging that asset, right? Because it doesn't have a plan. There's bits and pieces to the plan, but there's no driver. It seems to me what needs to be driving this, and you're going to laugh probably, is that the industry needs to be driving this and saying, if you guys want to do this, here we're proposing this. Having the lenders or the investors drive it, that there seems to be, that just comes off to me like, everybody suspects Wall Street, right? So it's like, what's in it for them?
We are in fact the most wholesome of this gang of 8 or whatever.
I've worked in a lot of that game.
Yeah, no. So our bonds are placed with pension funds, and that you guys are shareholders of. Okay, so mutual. I mean, there's a. I'll also make the plug for the bond rating agencies who are going to come in and vet these programs and place a coupon on the interest rate. Ultimately, we can also get federal loan guarantees for a program like this. We've done that before. We've been successful in getting FLGs for other programs. So that takes a year. There's a law required, a specific law for any federal loan guarantee program, but we know how to do that. Anyway, if there's a better way to
I love the concept. I'm just trying to shoot holes at like what would hold it up. What would be the barriers.
What would hold it up is Troy and Jaya, right? The contracting community. They're going to have kittens over this. Right? This completely does away with the whole SIR procurement selection aspect of this, which is what they do, what they know how to do, what they've always done.
Unfortunately, I mean, I've done a little of fundraising and stuff, and one of the things that I've run into is as soon as you stray from over the plate, when you're raising a fund, everybody's eyes just roll back, because they are used to looking at a certain, profile, a certain structure, could be for different things, but they're used to kind of the thing that they're used to, and when you start throwing them curveballs, even if it's innovative, they don't like it. And so that's what I'm trying to figure out, is how do we make it as over the
This
plate
can't
as
be done
possible.
without Congress, getting behind it. But there's an opportunity to do that.
Yeah,
We need to figure that out.
Yeah.
And, me standing in front of you and telling you how things are is not really what I didn't want you to have that impression. What the impression I wanted you to have is that we can mold this program into something that works and get Sensor going, but industry has to engage now.
Yeah.
The other part is, how do you really see the best value aspect of this? Because the best value, as we said, could be a bigger cost, greater benefit.
Well,
To some degree, it's the industry competing in there to get the best possible solution.
Yeah. Well, there are, many programs where the government decides that it's in the national interest to make a sole source procurement. This may be one of those.
Right, but isn't it the other way around? Because you're going to the government and saying,
Yeah.
this is the best value.
Well, our analysis has shown that, running this stuff as in part a substantial piece of this being fixed price is a risk reducing feature that the private sector bondholders want to see. I don't think we can put together a bond program where the cost of implementing the radars is unlimited. So I turn your question, your point back at you to say that this can be designed so that the risks are largely contained.
The risk to the government,
The risks to the government and the bondholders.
well, and the bondholders,
Yeah.
right? The risk to industry is significant.
Well, let's say the FAA wants to change the specifications two years into this program. Okay.
Which they
If we-
undoubtedly will.
So the agreement that we have with the FAA is if they do that, they have to cover those additional costs. That's one way to do it. Right now, that's what's done, with fighter programs, right? So,
Well, look at any large FAA procurement, ERAM stars, and
yeah,
you get into these programs, they become entities
unto themselves.
unto themselves.
Yeah,
And I'm not saying that's necessarily bad, because at the end of the day, the government gets a product that makes sense for the application. It's difficult to foresee when you're writing procurement
yeah,
what actually needs to be done. So the FAA, they write a procurement based on what they think they need and how to evaluate the proposals. And want to make everything cookie cutter so that industry can bid and they can evaluate, make a selection. And then once the program's awarded, then that's when you really start to design and implement the program. So you're saying no technology demonstration here, no?
no, I'm not saying that at all. I think there needs to be proof of concept. We can fund the research and development part of this, but why would it make sense for us to spend money funding a fly-off?
Yeah,
And there are 5 or 6, these are products. I mean, they're systems, but the radars are products. 5 or 6 companies that would love to manufacture these radars. So, there's a possibility of doing some type of development program where we take best of breed or what have you. Somebody has to be in charge. There has to be the head of this consortium that is, making calls, because the performance of the system has to comply with what the FAA requires. The FAA is setting the standards here. They have to set the standards.
I'm not arguing with it.
Yeah,
I'm just trying to understand.
yeah. Well, so, from our standpoint, we would like industry to tell us what we should fund. let me put it to you. We have the capital, what should we fund? You want a sensor program? Tell us what that's going to look like and how you're going to manage it. And we can provide the capital to do that. We're not engineers. We're money people.
Tolls, right? Basically, it's a toll, it's a securitizing toll.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's securitizable here is the spectrum
Yep.
proceeds. So that's a little different. If you look at Department of Energy and projects that they use federal loan guarantees for, these are multi-billion-dollar programs. So there is experience inside the federal government. There's just no experience inside the FAA. If you think about if the radar system descoping exercise that we heard about is true, then the FAA has even less reason to want to put senior leadership on this program. You do have to ask yourself why are such junior people running this program? They're really quite junior. They don't have the experience that others do inside of the government. So, and our advice to them to go and hire third-party financial experts has fallen on deaf ears because nobody's talking to Pat McNall. We know that from our discussions with Pat. So I don't want you to have the impression this is going to be easy, but this may be the only option, and we can be very smart and flexible working with industry to figure the pathway forward to get this done. And it's possible. I don't want to say the easiest part is the Wall Street funding, but it's the part we know, and we know, it can be done when we get all of the contractual side of this figured out. So the FAA, of course, wanted a competition, but there's perhaps a better way to do this program, or just forget it, because they're not going to fund they won't have the money to fund a fly-off. That's $1 billion. They're not going to put that
Can
up.
you give us these charts?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
What would you like to see happen next?
Yeah, so let me I got a couple more things too, but we're going to go quickly through this. So our taxpayer savings calculation, we can duplicate this because we have a financial model where we can use any assumptions about radar costs and schedule and construction costs. We've made wild assumptions about what those might be, but that's how we got to 12 billion. We felt that that was a sufficient amount to replace the L bands and get a start on the S and C band radars moving forward. In that respect, the 10-year T-bill is what would be the stake in the ground for our bonding costs. So this is about a 40-year view about the 10-year T-bill rate. And what you're seeing here is right now we're at pretty much an all-time low. I've seen it at 1.6% in the last few years. We did the Next Gen Fund back when bonds were sitting here. That's where we got the federal loan guarantees granted by Congress. But right now, today, I think yesterday, it's 1.75%. So the time to strike, is pretty soon. The next chart, which will be, has to do, so the bondholders, expect that we're going to try to squeeze risk out of these programs. So these are some of the things to consider. Federal loan guarantees, we would use bond insurance for sure. This is an option. And if we have to get congressional wording to mandate a consortium approach that we've been discussing and debating, that's possible to do, but we have to start working on it right away. And although we have funds for deployment on the Hill, if we're going to be advocating for a program for industry, we need industry's help to do that. We can't just go up and do it on our own. We need industry to come with us. Go to the next chart. So a lot of discussion about the value of the spectrum. We think that if the spectrum is vacated, it's probably $11 or $12 billion minimum allocation, which it helps to frame what we want to put on the table. If we're only funding, say, $8 billion, not $12 billion, then we're much more comfortable actually, because if the work starts pretty soon, in the next 12 months, there's a chance to replace a fair number of those radars. I don't think we need to. I think if the telcos who are going to buy the spectrum see that there is a construction program underway, and half the sites have been replaced already. That makes it much more attractive for them to pay top dollar because they can see the end. They can literally see the program is happening. And
So Mike, the auction participants have an incentive to make this happen because it could accelerate or at least prevent further delay of the auction. And they need the spectrum, right?
the spectrum is definitely in demand.
Have you talked to them, or have they been included in just sort of their?
They would be a good one to include. And we have talked with a couple of them.
Okay.
And we've had reports. We also had a spectrum expert who weighed in for us last year on this. So it's complicated,
Yeah.
and they don't want to commit to even showing up at the auction unless there's something to buy. We've heard from them that they're not planning anything on this because they don't see the government moving yet to replace the radars. So it's complicated, right?
Yeah.
In terms of the auction, are you seeing it's still going to stay at 30 megahertz, or you see the full 50 megahertz?
Yeah, so right now we're assuming 30 megahertz.
Staying at 30.
But the government does have the ability to go to 50, and they've made that clear. I think the technical committee might be able to weigh in on that if they do anything constructive.
It seems to me that if you can do 30, then you can easily do 50.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, these are very conservative estimates here, 14 to 19 billion. Yeah, we've had others say it's probably worth 30 to 40 billion for 50 megahertz of bandwidth. The L-band is cherished spectrum. We're not experts. Next chart. This has to do with auction insurability. So you can read this on your own. You guys will all have copies of the chart. I think we're done, at least. So why don't we continue the conversation?